this is Everyday Expertise, and I'm Angela. And I'm here today with Sal, also known as the Dark Cloak. He's an artist, illustrator, concept designer, and much more. He's a co founder and creator of the Anvil Art Forge Group and has worked with creatives from starting emerging artists to established professional veterans directly through his Artist Doing Being mentorship program. Hello.
Hey, glad to be
So,
here.
well, the first thing I want to ask you about is the pseudonym of the Dark Cloak. Where's that come from?
The Dark Cloak. Well, back when I was a teenager, I used to wear trench coats and things like that all the time. And also, there was a local haunting on my block around my house, and it was a man in a trench coat, or the man in the black cape is kind of how people talked about him. So because I wore the trench coats and because there was this haunting thing, people used to be like, making fun of me and making the nickname like, oh, here comes that cloak guy, here comes the cloak, oh, the black cape, right? That sort of thing. And when I started posting my art on the internet,
Mhm.
especially around that time, this is late 90s, I was like, well, I don't want to use my real name. That's boring. I don't like my real name, all that stuff. This, like, what should I use? And, like my nicknames, my, Sal Jr., like these other names are things that I was known as in the neighborhood besides, the nickname of the cloak and all that sort of thing. And my best friend at the time's like, well, why don't you just call yourself a Dark Cloak? Like, it's funny. I was like, you know what? Yeah, I'll use it. And so that's how it started. I started posting my work online on Epilogue.
Mm.
Epilogue.net is where I started out as the Dark Cloak. And it just kind of became a thing. And I've been working that name ever since.
Oh, that's cool. So, well, I guess the car kind of brings us into how did you get started as an artist?
Oh boy. I've been drawing since I was like 3, 4. One of my earliest artistic memories is stealing some of my dad's liquid paper,
Hmm.
whiteout, and turning a fire truck into an ambulance because I wanted an ambulance. I didn't want a fire truck. But yeah, crayons, markers. I think the first superhero me and my cousin invented was this super baby. It was basically a toddler with superpowers. I was like 4 or 5. And then the other big thing that happened was video games, cartoons, movies, and that really just kept my imagination going. And then eventually became comics and board games and everything else.
Hmm. That's pretty cool.
Thanks.
What are your preferred mediums?
Um, Honestly, everything. If it makes marks or if it makes noises, I'll use it. I work in digital. I work in traditional, and then aside from that, I make music and stuff. As far as my creative career, it's had quite a wide breadth. I've worked in film. I've worked in theater. I worked in software advertising, game development, tabletop gaming, card games, and I love it all. For
Mm.
me, really, the whole wheelhouse, all of it, everything that I do makeup and special effects and sculpting and everything as well. For me, it's all storytelling. No matter what you're doing, it's all storytelling, and these are all just different tools for expression. So
Mm.
I embrace them all fully.
Any particular software that you you cleave to?
Unfortunately, Photoshop. But these days, I do split a lot of my workload between Photoshop and Clip Studio Paint. Clip
Mm.
Studio has hands down the best engine for inking in particular that
Mm.
I've ever used. So that really facilitates work doing that work, especially because I do often mix my traditional work with my digital work. So scanning things in, or mixed media, or sometimes scanning things in, working it digitally, and then printing it out, working it in, working it traditionally, and then just kind of regurgitating it over and over until I get the results that I'm looking for.
Mm. That's interesting. What are your major influences?
Oh boy. Well, video games for a start. I mentioned that when I was, from being a kid. Monster movies were a huge influence, as you can probably tell.
Hmm.
Um, Artistically, I want to say that the first artist that made me take notice that, wow, people get paid for this was Paul Bonner.
Mm.
Me and my friends were playing the Mutant Chronicles board game, and Paul Bonner's work on that game in particular looked a lot like what I saw in my head. And when I saw his work, I was like, that's the level I want to get to. And yeah, it was pretty much that and lots of Ninja Turtles. I spent a lot of time drawing Ninja Turtles. Um, and then after that, it just became, learning more about the craft of filmmaking.
Mhm.
One of the books that kind of broke a lot of boundaries, self boundaries for me at a very young age was I haphazardly found a copy of The Making of Terminator 2 at
Hmm.
a dollar store of all places. And it's a dollar. It was a dollar. Like I still have it on the shelves in here somewhere. But I bought it right away, took it home, and just devoured it. And what blew my mind away about that book was for the first time realizing just how many different disciplines come together in to make a film like Terminator 2. You have
Mhm.
miniature work, you have sculpting, makeup, you have storyboard artists, you have, that's when I really started learning about production and all of that. And before that moment, I was very much bought into the idea that, you can only be one thing. You can
Mm.
only be a comic artist. You can only be an animator. You can only be a sculptor. And growing up, I loved all of those things. I was making little mini comics for my friends at school, or doing makeup things at the house and making a mess in the bathroom. My mom loved that. I was a kid running around the neighborhood with the camera when my parents first got their camcorder, making movies. I was that kid,
Right.
and you know so I tried all of those things, but all of them felt very pigeonholed to me, and they all felt very, there was a dishonesty to it.
Mhm.
But when I opened those doors, and that book made me realize all of what goes into films, because I think when you're growing up and when you're a kid, you're just consuming stuff. You're playing games, you're watching movies, you're watching cartoons, but you don't think about the number of people and the different things that go into creating those products.
Mm.
And that was the popcorn moment between Paul Bunner and the tabletop stuff and that book. I was like, whoa. And then Stan Winston, of course, his name kept getting repeated. I was like, Stan Winston. And then I started looking, researching who he was, and looking at that stuff. And of course, pretty much every favorite monster movie of mine, and Terminator, Predator, all these different effects things that caught my imagination forever were things that Stan Winston and his studio had touched. So that
Mm.
made me dive deeper into that direction, concept art and everything else as well. So that's kind of where it all just started bubbling up from. And then I've just pursued it whole hog ever since.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that actually, that kind of goes into my next question. You sort of consider yourself, I think, a multidisciplinarian. I think. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, you've worked on all these different types of projects, had all sorts of different roles. How do you feel that they, sort of intersect and inform each other?
Um, well, like I said, everything's
Yeah.
storytelling, but one of the biggest surprises that I've had up until now in my life is that even jobs that I hated have first in some way or another shaped and formed and bolstered my skill set, my experience, my ability to tell stories, my ability to understand people. Philosophy and psychology are two big passions of mine as well, which is part of what I do with the
Hmm.
mentorship stuff. And really, all of it is just better storytelling,
Hmm.
more tangibility. And then the other aspect of the name, the Dark Cloak, is that ever since I was a kid, because I'm obsessed with monsters and things like that, one of my big themes that I pursue is what's beneath the surface.
Hmm.
And all of that ties into all of those things. So that's, I think, where it also thematically kind of just comes back to like a core seed or a core philosophy or
Yeah.
ideology, if you will.
Mm. No, that makes sense. And yeah, and then definitely, yeah, your work has this great sort of dark atmosphere, right?
Yeah.
And so, what is it? What is it about dark horror and dark sci-fi and fantasy that really like pulls at you, that it appeals to you?
Well, the initial impulse, from a kid was
Yeah.
monsters, creatures, robots, all of that. But it's seeing something that's, otherworldly, something that's not
Hmm.
very common, something out of, supernatural. But as I was growing up and I learned to reflect on myself as well, is I learned why I empathize with characters like Frankenstein's creature.
Mhm.
or RoboCop or things like that in the way that people are very surface, and I like challenging those perspectives, even for myself. And one of the um, one of the things that humanity isn't particularly known for not being judgy, and I like challenging people's preconceptions. If they see something like, "Oh, it's scary," it's like, "Well, is it really?" Because in my experience, the ones who are truly monsters are the people that you just see on the street, and you wouldn't know that
Mm.
they're horrible. So a lot of it is driven by that, but also, and this has been talked a lot about, talked about a lot by
Mm.
people like Guillermo del Toro, especially in recent years. But horror and the dark is a great mirror and a great lens to explore our own darknesses if we're willing to do that work.
Mm.
And one of the things I think about often is the concepts of like projection and denial and avoidance. And there's that famous saying by Nietzsche saying where he says, when fighting monsters, one must beware of becoming a monster themselves and gaze
Mm.
into the abyss. That whole thing. Nietzsche was a monster. He wasn't a nice guy.
Yeah.
And when I think about that phrase, I think, wow, denial much.
Mhm.
And I often find that the people who virtue signal the most and who make who talk about those precautions so much and fear and all of these things, especially in this current climate that we live in today, right?
Mhm.
Um, are oftentimes the worst, and I think it's because they just haven't dived into their own abysses to explore their own darknesses, to cope with that stuff, to not avoid it, to confront it, dismantle it, and to gain agency over it in a way that's truly self expressive and self empowering.
Mm.
I think people in general are very fear and insecurity and projection driven. Um, and I think if we're willing to face our own darkness, we can face any darkness more
Mm.
mindfully. That's where
Yeah.
a lot of it comes from. Is it's all just this big morass of thoughts and ideas. I think a lot.
That's good. It's good.
Thank you.
Well, then I think, like I mentioned in your sort of intro here, you have this mentorship program
I
called
do.
Artists Doing Slash Being.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah. What is that?
So about 4 years ago, I had some pretty major epiphanies regarding my upbringing, regarding the philosophy and psychology that I've been consuming for ages, my
Hmm.
own failures, my own psychology, my own demons, if you will. And so what happened is I had a friend who every day, I mean, I'm sure we all know people like this. Every day they were posting something negative and like complaining and all of this sort of thing.
Mm.
And they were the kind of they were the kind of person where if you try to help them or give them solutions, nothing. Like, well, you don't understand, or my problems are so much worse than that because. And there was always a reason. There was always a rationale. And one time we were in a conversation, and I was basically trying to have an intervention with them. I'm like, you're hurting my friend, i.e., themselves. Um, we need to figure this out. And it was a tough conversation because they weren't ready to hear or see what they needed to see to get those breakthroughs. But
Mhm.
in that conversation, a very vivid pattern came through, and what they were saying, the words they were using, the language, and how they were using that language. The Ouroboros, the snake eating its own
Yeah.
tail. It was basically that very vivid image popped into my head as I was listening to them talk. And basically, what they were saying was this: if the tail of the snake, right, was people don't listen to me or understand me, therefore I'm frustrated and angry and tired all the time. If that's the tail, the head was expressing as it's not my job to explain myself to people, so forget them, forget everybody.
Mm.
And I was like, oh my God, that's like such a catch 22. Do you not realize what you've just said? You're kind of keeping yourself in that loop. they couldn't hear it at the time, and that call didn't end very well. Um, but when the call ended, I just sat back and I went, that was really interesting. Like there's this really vivid loop there happening. And usually what I do when I notice that in other people is I turn it on myself immediately. I go, what do I have that sounds like that? So for a little bit of background on what led to this moment, I had my first very like, what the heck, existential moment when I was about 4 years old. It was one of those situations. My mom made she made some stew or some soup that I didn't want to eat. It was yucky. I was a kid. I was like, and I'm sitting there poking at it and all of this stuff. And I grew up in a fairly religious household, Catholic household, and it was often heard around the house and things like that. Oh, if something bad happened, it's the devil made them do it. If something good happened, God made them do it. And I was a very smart ass kid. I don't know how my parents did it, raising me. But so I'm sitting there poking the soup and everything, and I started trying to think of ways to get rid of it. I'm like, I could throw it in the trash. No, mom will find out. I'll get in trouble. I could throw it on the floor. Nope, no dog. Can't feed it to the dog. I'm like, what if I just pick it up and just throw it at the wall and just throw a tantrum? I'm thinking this. I'm processing all the choices I could make and the consequences of those choices. And I was like, no, that's not going to work. And I just started like playing with my fingers and fiddling with the spoon. And as I was playing with my fingers, I went, these are my hands. Like I'm moving these fingers. But wait a minute. So that means if I throw this on the floor, or throw it on the wall, or anything like that, that's not the devil making me do it. That's not God making me do it. That's me doing that. And I went, whoa. I was like 4. I was like, we're not cameras, right? Kid logic. I'm like, we're not cameras. We're not robots. Because, when you're a kid, you're watching everybody. You're kind of just like on rails, and other people seem to be on rails, and people just kind of seem to have their own behaviors and loops. And I was just like, whoa, like this is my hand. I'm doing this stuff. I'm making choices here. And I got up and I go up to my mom and I pull on her shirt. I'm like, mom. She's like, what? I'm like, give me your hand. So she gives me her hand. I'm like, okay, move this finger. All right, I'll move that finger. Okay, now you pick a finger and you move that finger. And she moves her thumb or something. And I go, so you did that, right? And she goes, well, yeah, it's my hand. And she's looking at me like, what the heck are you, what is going on with this kid? And I said, yeah, exactly. It's your hand. God didn't make you do it. Devil didn't make you do it. It's your hand. You made the choice. And she like stopped and like put the dishes down. She was in the dishes at the time. She just looked at me like really thinking about what I was saying. It's like, we're not cameras, we're not robots, mom. We can do stuff. We're not just on little rails. And then she said, well, that's all really nice and everything, but you still got to eat your soup. And I went, she's right. Like, so I grudgingly went and ate the soup and everything. But ever since that moment, I became very obsessed with what is mind, what is consciousness, what is choice, what is agency, all of these things. And that's when I started pursuing, philosophy and psychology. And obviously, sci-fi is very, very steep with these things, cyberpunk,
Yeah.
all of these things. And of course, horror has a lot of existentialism, and of course, Lovecraft. We can get into all of that stuff. But that's kind of who I was as a little kid growing up, as I was really looking, searching, learning, exploring constantly. So here we are, fast forward back to this moment where I'm sitting back going, what do I have that sounds like this Ouroboros, this loop? So I went, because growing up, I was a very disappointed kid in humanity. I didn't, people were just so disappointing. Like adults didn't know what they were doing, wars and, the things I saw on the streets, all of that stuff. It was awful. And I was just, man, people are just like, what the hell? So I grew up pretty upset and disappointed and everything at just humanity. And that all led to this moment. And I went, well, people suck. And here's the thing about these Ouroboroses is that they're always logical. They always there's always a reasonable angle to them, right?
Yeah.
If you're not being listened to or heard or understood, of course that's frustrating. We all know what that's like. So for me, being disappointed with humanity and all of that stuff, plenty of evidence for that. You go to YouTube comments, and there's plenty of evidence for it. There's plenty of evidence on social media, for example, alone, let alone the news and everything else.
Mm.
And I'm like, yeah, okay, so people stink. All right. And so what's the head of that? Sound like, well, if theirs sounded like it's not my job to, what would mine sound like? Well, it's not my job to do anything about it because they should know better. And when I heard myself go, they should know better, I went, oh, that's gross. Because I'm just operating from the assumption that people should know better. And in that split second, I realized that I was basically projecting my own upbringing onto everybody else
Mhm.
and my own explorations and all of that stuff onto everybody else, basically assuming that everybody had done the same work that I had. And I realized just how terrible that was. So I went, damn, that's really gross. I'm like, okay, so how do I flip that? Because that's once you have those epiphanies and you're looking at them like this, it's just you can't ignore them.
Mm.
So I'm like, how do I flip that? Like, what if it was my job? And when I did that, I went, oh crap. I could not take that back. That moment hit, and I was like, oh, man, now I have to do something about it.
Mhm.
And I was like, all right, so what's my motivation here? Like, what is really my motivation? Because that's the next step. Is like, if I get really, really selfish here or something like that, like, what are all the possible angles I can use to explore this? And I thought, well, money is great and everything, but money is really just a tool. Money comes and goes. We have bills and all that. What really gets me excited about this essentially new world that I've opened my eyes to? I'm like, well, chances are, like, who do I want to work with? First of all, I'm like, well, I want to work with people in the creative community. Um, and chances are that I'll be working with, I'll be working for, maybe art directing somebody, being art directed by somebody else, or maybe even just as a peer level. All of this stuff, various industries that overlap. Like, I'd rather, at the most selfish level, I'd rather work with people who are grounded in themselves and have mindfulness and empathy, and or at the very least are kind to themselves, than with people who are going to cause a lot of stress and drama and conflict and all of that. And it's like, that's a really good motivator. I started thinking more, and I was like, well, what kind of things do we usually see in the art communities? It's not uncommon. It has gotten better in the last few years, but it's not uncommon to see people post a really good piece of artwork and people go, man, I'll never be able to draw like that. I'm just going to quit. Ha 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 ha. And like, they're joking, but there's that undercurrent of ick there.
Mm.
I'm like, and it's always annoyed me, like that kind of behavior, because it perpetuates imposter syndrome. It perpetuates crab mentality. It perpetuates that giving away of personal agency and all of that. And it really inhibits us. Um, and I think people deserve to treat themselves better. So that's really what my prime motivator was. And thankfully, I have friends who do some of this kind of work for a living. So I reached out to them just to like help me get started and like formalize my ideas and theories into things that make sense for homework and all that sort of thing in the structure. And here I am. I've been doing it now for 3.5 years, and it's been wild. It's been incredibly rewarding, and I think the the short moment that really proved to me that this stuff really shifted a bunch of things for me was a friend of mine. We were out for dinner together and just talking and hanging out. And he knew a little bit about what I was doing with this mentorship and everything, but he asked me, say, so how's it going? You seem a little different. And I caught him up to speed and things like that. And he goes, wow, that's really interesting. He's like, you know how you used to be? And I said, no, tell me. And he goes, well, he's like, if it's like you've been riding a bike for a while, but then when other people try to ride that bike, if they'd fall, you kind of get mad at them and yell at them.
Mm.
And I leant back and I went, you know what? That's fair. And his mouth just hung open. He's like, what? I'm like, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That's fair. I'm sorry I behaved that way. And he went, holy crap, you are different. And what I've realized since then is I used to be very much a tough love minded
Mhm.
individual. But where I'm at now, and I have been for the last 2, 3 years, is I say that my way is the way of ruthless compassion.
Mhm.
And the thing about ruthless compassion is that that door swings both ways.
Mhm.
Swings back towards myself as well as the people that I deal with. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the mentorship thing. So what I do with people is I help them get out of their own way. I help them dismantle their, I call them the old crappy mixtapes. You know, the residual things that people leave behind in us, whether it's old experiences or something somebody said to us, and all those
Mhm.
core defining moments that we often carry around with us. But in particular with art, and art is really just the vehicle and the means, but
Mhm.
essentially affects everything that we do in life. And that's why it's called the doing being mentorship. Doing is, the fundamental stuff, anatomy, perspective, color, all of that. And then being is all the introspective stuff, is
Mhm.
dismantling all of these things, all these behaviors that get in our way of pursuing our craft and self-expression.
That's pretty awesome.
Thanks. That's my TED talk.
Okay, so you mentioned already that something that surprised you was how even the jobs you didn't like uh, helped you somehow, right? Is there anything else you wish you'd known about art before you began?
Yes. I think I wasted a lot of time, particularly growing up, with the idea that using reference was cheating. And it just baffles me how many people still perpetuate that stigma.
That's terrible.
Uh,
There's so many people who use reference. I mean, if you're going to be a professional artist, you need it, right? Because
right,
otherwise, yeah.
absolutely.
I mean, how are you going to get stuff out? You know?
Every single artist that I've ever looked up to has used reference.
Mhm.
And the idea that people go, well, you should be able to draw everything from the top of your head or you're not a real artist. Like that kind of gatekeeping conversation, it happens. It
I know.
happens. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But yeah, haven't I wish I had not wasted so much time with that. Like on
Mm.
some levels, it was good because it forced me to like brute force get better.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I did also waste a lot of time with that.
Mhm.
And I see it in other ways too. Like I see people, there's always those conversations like traditional versus digital, or this tool is better than that tool, all of that
Mm.
stuff. And I think it's just a lot of gatekeeping, a lot of insecurity and projection. And I think whatever helps you express yourself, and if it's a tool you enjoy using, just use it.
Mm.
Right, that you're
Definitely.
not breaking copyright.
Yeah. Or making your reference look too much like a real person.
Exactly. All of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think that that'd be the one.
That's pretty cool. So, how do you maintain work-life balance?
What is that? um,
That's not an
well,
uncommon answer to this question.
I'm a full-time freelance artist. And there's times that there's too much free time.
Mhm.
And there's times that there's not enough free time. But one of the things that actually has helped me with that is I call it nothing time.
Mhm.
And every week I try to schedule at 4 hours, mandatory 4 hours of nothing time. And what nothing time means is it's literally no expectation time.
Mhm.
If I sit there and stare at the wall for 4 hours, that's what I did. Or sometimes I break it up depending on what my schedule is looking like, but essentially 4 hours of nothing time. If
Mhm.
I take a nap, if I actually just decide to keep working through it, if I play video games, it doesn't matter what I do. There's no obligation, no expectation. It's just exist or don't exist time. It's literally just nothing time. And that has alleviated so much pressure in my mind. It's been just really cathartic and really therapeutic, and really freeing. But what the other thing that I like about it, the other byproduct of it, is that it reinforces the idea of agency.
Mm.
Um, because I think whenever we do things because we should, there's a level of resentment there that impacts whatever it is we're doing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so I like to manage that way with nothing time.
That's good. No, I think that's a good way of approaching
Useful for anybody watching.
it. So, do you have a favorite aspect of making art?
Yes, I would say ultimately, I could get into, well, I like the sketching process. Well, I really like the rendering process and adding light and color and all that stuff. But I think ultimately, it's I think from a very young age, I made it a point to look for things to fall in love with every piece of artwork that I was working on, with every project I was working on. Even if it was something uninteresting, or sometimes you take on work that you're like not too excited about, I would always find something to get into, to fall in love with, whether it's learning about textiles or learning about a certain culture, or you know um, certain types of lighting. I mean, there's so many different things you can find in anything that you're working in, and I think that is my favorite thing, because I like learning,
That's
like
great.
learning, and like challenging myself.
That's great. Do you have a least favorite? Something that frustrates
Least
you?
favorite, uh, computer errors. That is probably my least favorite. Um, yeah, I would say that's my least favorite. Creative block and things like that, I don't really have that problem. I haven't had that problem since I was like 20.
Hmm.
Again, because a lot of that kind of work that I do, um, breakthrough with creative block that I had, and I think this is part of why I don't have it, is um, one of the last times I had it, I just did something to make fun of it. I made a I made a silly rap song,
Hmm.
hip hop song about creative block, and I ended up making something pretty decent. And it was about the creative block. Instead of just making the creative block stop me, I just ended up using it as something to talk about. And I think ever since then, I just don't have that. So yeah, I would say that. I would say anytime things go wrong in a way that doesn't really have to do with the creative process. So
Hmm.
paint spilling on your canvas, or Photoshop closing unexpectedly without backing up a copy of what you were working on.
Mm.
Computer errors in general, wacom drivers suddenly disappearing in the middle of a stroke, that sort of thing.
So, how do you cope with stress and obstacles when things are just not working out?
So part of what comes with all of the things that I do, because I do a lot,
Hmm.
is just sheer stubbornness. This is what I'm saying. Like when I was growing up as a kid, like I don't know how my parents did it, because I was a smart ass, mouthy, willful kid,
Hmm.
and I still am. So yeah, when it comes to those problems, it's basically that. I just get really willful and determined to resolve the thing. So if I do spill paint on the canvas, I'll try to find a way to make it into a texture, or turn that into something else and start over on something else. Start over on the original thing on a different canvas if necessary. Um,
Hmm.
Bob Ross saying there are no accidents, just they're just happy accidents, no
Hmm.
mistakes. Um, but yeah, with computers, man, I think when it really gets me with computers is when it eats into your day
Mm.
in a professional way. You're
Right.
losing hours, you're losing time on your deadlines, you're literally losing money, because that's livelihood, and that
Hmm.
that can't be replaced.
Definitely.
Time loss isn't time that can be replaced. So I think that is probably the most frustrating part of that process.
Yeah. No kidding. And especially when you're working from home essentially. So
Yeah,
it's not like you can call in an IT department to
right.
solve
Okay.
your problem.
And it's funny you mentioned that, because one of the things that my parents drilled into my head from a very young age, two things.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that you learn is good for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And everything that you don't know will probably cost you something.
Mm.
I'm like, oh yeah. So I've learned to fix my own computers and do a lot of that stuff out of necessity. But there's also that tinkerer in me. I do like tinkering.
Mm-hmm.
I was a kid who my parents would come home from groceries or whatever, and the TV would be in pieces or the radio would be in pieces because I was trying to figure out how it worked. I oftentimes put them back together and they work fine still. There was a few times.
Oh, those are good philosophies, I think.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. They didn't think so, but I think so.
All right. I think we've talked about a lot, but do you have any more advice for people starting out?
For people starting out, don't be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Be afraid. Go after it. Life is short. Life is too short to spend it afraid, especially afraid of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So, how can people find out more about you and your work?
The easiest way would be go to my website, thedarkcloak.com. All my links for all my social media, including like my SoundCloud, Twitch. I stream on Twitch twice a week. I stream on Mondays and Wednesdays. I'm hoping to pump up more days now that I've got this space all sorted out, making music and doing book reviews and all sorts of other stuff.
That's cool. And we will have links to all that in the description below. So check that out. All right. Thank you, Sal.
Thank you.
Thank you,
It was a
everybody, for
pleasure to
watching.
be here with you, Angela.
The pleasure's all mine. Thank you, everybody, for watching. This has been Everyday Expertise. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this interview. Be sure to share this video with friends and colleagues who may also enjoy this topic. Let us know your thoughts by leaving a comment below or check the description for our social media. See you next time.